Hello, I'm Michael Pierce, and this is The Human Condition. Our topic today is carnivore and keto problems. A number of people have complained about trying carnivore and keto and said it didn't work for me. And so, because that's such a large number of people that have tried something and had some trouble with guidance, I want to talk about that today. A lot of people have tried carnivore and keto and done extremely well their first shot, but many people tried it and they didn't have the right guidance. They didn't have the right help, and they didn't have experienced people helping them overcome things like keto flu or other difficulties with digestion, with elimination, with bowel movements, with their stomach, how their body feels, and even how their skin handles it. So we want to talk about the fixes for these and what the problems are and how that can help somebody, because there's a lot of people who could benefit from the idea of very modified carnivore and keto diets. There are many, many subgroups and sub-flavors, if you will, of keto and carnivore diets. There's not just one. So there's not one keto and there's not one carnivore. And finding your own diet is the most important thing, I think, that people need to do and that they have the biggest trouble with because their doctors don't help them. It's what led me to go to culinary school after being a physician, because I couldn't really understand what to do. We would tell people what to eat and tell them what not to eat roughly, but it didn't really work and it didn't really help a lot of people unless we got really in the weeds with them and started to help them on an almost daily basis for some cases, or weekly basis. Many of my friends that were doctors would give their patients a basket of supplements, and they would analyze their labs and tell them, here's what's wrong with you, take these supplements and I'll see you in 3 months. And that really didn't work for a lot of people because they run into troubles within 2 or 3 days because of the way that their unique body will start to purge, the way that their body will react to different things. And all those reactions are normal and really pretty simple to understand if you've got experience and you've done it with thousands of people. But if you haven't done that, it could be very, very confusing. So I'm going to talk about really basically roughly four ways that this starts to emerge, and 4 patterns that begin to show up for people. So the first one is that you lose weight and you crave grain and you're not satisfied by other carbohydrates like fruit. This is really one of the hardest ones. And this is one where the individual really cannot burn fat. They eat fat, but they can't burn it. They might comply with the ketogenic diet. They might get into ketosis. They might have trouble getting into ketosis. But the point is they're eating a lot of fat and they just can't burn it, and they feel starving all the time. They drop weight like crazy. They crave carbohydrates. And when they eat fruit, it's just not satisfying to them. And it's not enough to get their calories from carbohydrates from fruit. They feel addicted and they feel like they must have grains, often grain flours, wheat, rice, corn, oats, that kind of stuff. It's often other flours like grains, beans, nuts, and seeds, which would include, a lot of people would use almond flour, a nut flour. So this is where we face a particular problem that can be poor bile, but more importantly, it can also be something which is a morphine reaction. So the person becomes a bit of a heroin addict of their own heroin because we manufacture morphine. We manufacture, in some cases, when we have dysbiosis or imbalance in our guts, we manufacture gluteomorphine, caseomorphine, soy morphine. There are a number of plant food proteins that we convert into morphines, and that process makes us addicted. When you remove those from a person, you are kind of subject to the rules of opiate addiction. And that means that the mu-opiate receptor in your brain really can't get better for about 8 weeks. It takes about 8 weeks to reset that receptor. That's why you may have heard stories about people being chained to a radiator when they're heroin addicts and they go through this horrible withdrawal, but most don't die and most recover. They want to die, they feel like they're going to die, and they get chained to the radiator, and as long as someone feeds them and waters them, they can get better, because the purpose of the chaining to the radiator is not some awful thing, it's to get them to not have heroin. And if they can stay off the heroin for 8 weeks, their mu-opiate receptors set back to normal, and they're just like everybody else again. They've lost their tolerance if they've built in a high tolerance for that kind of thing. So again, it's not exactly the same as someone shooting up with those kinds of drugs, but it's a very similar type of feeling. And in children, it really is difficult because they'll behave in ways that are really inappropriate, and they'll act like little monsters sometime, and they won't act like your kid. You'll say, this is a different child, what's going on? And that's really what's happening with this is there's a reason for it. And so we've got to do that. There are doctors that have used morphine blocking drugs. There are people that have done things like take glucosamine sulfate and MSM, which are pills that a person can take, or powders that will often bind to some of those glutens and carry them out in the stool. It's also necessary for some of these patients to really goose their gallbladder and stimulate the production of their pancreas and their liver, which means taking things like ox bile and things like lecithin and things like taurine. The next one is somewhat similar. This is gas and bloating and pain and bowel changes. This is where an individual might have trouble with both bile and stomach acid deficits. When you eat food, your protein and your minerals hit your stomach, and they really require stomach acid to be digested and absorbed. And if you don't have enough stomach acid, which very commonly comes from zinc deficiencies, the person may need zinc. They may need a stomach acid supplement for a while until their stomach can wake up and do its job again. In fact, most reflux esophagitis that people are given acid blockers for, the real cause of reflux is hypochlorhydria, or low stomach acid. So the real solution is to stop eating foods that mess up their digestion and give them enough stomach acid to be able to digest. The only time this isn't true is when they have an ulcer. And there are breath tests for H. pylori, which is the bacteria that's associated with ulcers. And so that certainly would be a problem. But that's really the only thing that gets in the way, in most cases, of using stomach acid to help with that problem. If a person can't digest their protein and their minerals, they just pass them right out and they lose them through their stool. So after the stomach, then the bolus of food goes into the small intestine, and that's where it gets hit with bile. And bile flips the pH from acidic to alkaline to basic. And that alkaline or basic fluid is bile. And bile is really important. Most of us have had our bile turned off by all the years of plant foods and antinutrients that we've eaten. So if that's the case, we've got to give our pancreas and liver time to wake up and start producing stronger bile and start moving that bile and transferring it out into the gallbladder. And if you don't have a gallbladder, don't worry. There's enough ductwork and space inside the liver and the tubes of the pancreas that you can make up for missing a gallbladder. So if your gallbladder has been taken, a person can still make enough and store enough bile to be able to digest a fatty meal and be on a keto and carnivore diet. Realize this isn't medical advice, and I'm not your doctor. You have to clear this stuff past your own doctor. But with that said, let's move on. One of the problems that happens with people is that they also need to clear out the anti-nutrients. If they have a bunch of anti-nutrients are basically undigestible proteins. And so these undigestible proteins, or partially digestible proteins, end up being a consistency of peanut butter and very sticky. And it can take weeks and weeks for that to come out of the body. Studies of dairy products have shown that it could take 3 to 12 weeks and sometimes up to 2 years to get all that residue out of the villi and the small little rough patches, Peyer's patches in different parts of your intestine. Now, we use fiber to get that gone sometimes. I'm not a big fan of fiber, but many people use fiber. I think that it's better to use fruit, and I think it's better to use sodium, salt. I think it's better to use, other types of binders like charcoal, activated charcoal. I like glucosamine sulfate. I like bladderwrack kelp, which is a great cleanser of the bowels. So if a person can get their bowels cleaned out and get that residue out, they feel quite a bit better. Now, what happens with them is once they switch to a carnivore or keto diet and they start eating high fat and more meat, they start to say, wow, my bowels are really sticky and I'm really constipated. Well, they're constipated for a couple reasons, and they think it's because they don't have enough fiber, and it really isn't that the case at all, because so many other carnivores and keto people can abide without any fiber whatsoever, or very little fiber. When a person goes on a low-carb diet, it changes their insulin response in their kidneys, and it makes them lose more sodium and potassium, and it makes them require about twice as much sodium. This is in all your kidney physiology textbooks, folks. So I'm not just whistling Dixie. It's important to understand that a person can also, as they're eating this new meat, can feel constipated because they're still pushing out that rotten anti-nutrients from plants. And so that could take a number of weeks while a person is getting rid of that stuff. And they might mistakenly ascribe this to undigested meat. And that doesn't really happen over time. In fact, Ken Berry does a great job of talking about how carnivores will fully digest meat and meat products if they don't have any plant products inside them. So this idea that we get clogged up from undigested red meat is really false. That's not true in carnivore animals, and it's not true in carnivore people. It's not true in the Inuit and the Sami tribes. It's not true in some of the other tribes. I know I've talked about Eskimo, and I know that term isn't so great anymore, but there are people that don't know who I'm talking about unless I use that term, which isn't used anymore. So I had to use it. There is another one, which is just plain old extreme hunger, and that is where they need trace minerals. They need like 70 trace minerals. They need to calculate their macros because they haven't calculated their total calories properly, and they may not be consuming enough total calories because they forgot that they're using their brain every day and they're not convalescing or fasting. They're not sitting in a hospital. They're not at a yoga retreat where they need just their basal metabolic rate, which might be 1,400 calories, and they can't live off that. They have to live on something like 2,000 or 2,500 calories because they're using their brain and they're going to work and they're exercising and they're raising kids and they're doing all the things that people do. So they need more total calories. Very often with that, you'll see that people might not have enough protein, enough macros of protein. Especially the women in my practice tend to want to keep protein low because they're worried that they'll gain weight. So it's important to calculate with a good doctor or with AI or with your own websites that you can find, like ruled.me, RULED.me is one that's very, very helpful. It's free and it can help calculate keto diets. There's many of them out there, but the concept is if you don't calculate what your protein needs are and you're deficient in protein, you're going to crave carbs and you're going to be hungry all the time, even if you're eating enough calories. Also, a number of people don't know that the low carb diets all start at about 50% of your calories from fat and about 26% of your calories from carbohydrates. And so that leaves about 24% or so from protein. So that's kind of how you start a low carb diet is in that range. People mistakenly think that a low carb diet is a high protein diet, and it isn't. It's adequate protein and a lot of fat. And many people just can't digest the fat at the beginning, and it takes them weeks and weeks to learn how to do that. And as they purge all of that gunk out of their intestines, that undigested anti-nutrients from plants. They also may need L-carnitine. L-carnitine is a amino acid that helps a person burn fat. Fat is metabolized and it needs L-carnitine to be burned, and many people have not had that. The last category, the fourth category really, is the adrenal response. And that is when people don't realize how stressed out they are or how busy their life and job is. And so I think one of the most common things that I get in my world is executives that call me and tell me, I wake up and I'm intermittent fast, I skip breakfast. And that's really good for a lot of reasons. However, if you have a very high demand job with a lot of stress, you may need food right away in the morning. And that might mean eating a keto breakfast or even having some carbs. Now, I'm not saying that everyone always needs carbs, but some people may need a transition. And there are some groups with certain brainwave types and certain genetics, according to Verta Health and some other folks, that may need a little more carbs than somebody on a carnivore diet or a keto diet. We'll talk about that in another video, but even those people still can get by on what's defined as a low carb diet. Even if they can't fully function on a keto or a carnivore diet, they can still tolerate low carb, which again, 26% calories from carbs, over 50%, pushing 70 and more percent fat, generally. So that's what we're looking for. They may still need, a couple hundred of calories from carbohydrates if they have that particular problem. These are usually fast oxidizers, people that can tolerate burning carbs that get really hypoglycemic. They're often very lean, very muscular. They have explosive energy. They're sprinters. And we can talk more about that later. But everyone, even if you're not a sprinter, might get an adrenal response, which is where the person puts out excess cortisol and maybe excess adrenaline or epinephrine. And that is something that will drive their liver to release sugar from the stored glycogen in the liver in the morning. And that surge that you're supposed to have of cortisol in the morning ends up mobilizing the sugar out of the liver. It cascades and pours out of the liver. You use it, you need it. It makes your blood sugar rise, then your insulin rises, then you have a little insulin resistance, especially if you're deficient in certain nutrients, and then you crash. And so you have hypoglycemia, and then you're hungry and your day is just messed up. So some people really aren't ready for fasting. I'm a big fan of fasting, and I'm a big fan of intermittent fasting. But if your adrenals have not been figured out, then you might need to do a few things. There are some dietary things that can be done, things like taking ashwagandha, things like taking omega-3s and DHA, maybe even taking DHEA, which is not DHA. Also, people may need to take vitamin B5. Some people may need magnesium. Some people may need some more of these B vitamins that they get from beef organ meat pills. All of these will contribute to healthy energy without needing coffee or stimulants and without needing your own adrenal response in the morning. One of the signs of that, some of the signs of that might be sweating in the forehead or under the arms or in the chest. It might be a feeling of jitteriness, a feeling of I'm kind of irritable, I'm forgetful, I'm spacey. Those are all signs of needing sugar in the morning when you wake up, being hypoglycemic, and then your adrenals kick in. Still, other people have adrenal fatigue where their adrenals don't kick in and they're flatlined and they can't produce the adrenal response that they need. And those people will be very fatigued whether they eat or not. those people, you must realize that it can take even Olympic athletes 12 weeks to become fat adapted, and that's even in the best of circumstances. So you might take longer to become fat adapted and be able to have a flexible metabolism where one can go from carbohydrates to fat and back again smoothly. Many people don't do that very well, and when they come out of ketosis and they're not burning fat anymore, they crash into burning carbohydrates again, and all their symptoms come rushing back. That's my quick little section on carnivore and keto problems. Thanks.